Hello, this is Kyle Malone, and I serve as Senior Manager of Partnerships at Grantmakers for Education, and like to welcome everyone to our webinar today entitled Education 2020: How the Presidential Race Can Shape and Be Shaped by Education Issues. Uh, Grantmakers for Education is delighted to host this conversation today on the important role of education in the upcoming 2020 election, which, by the way, is 325 days away, not very far. For today's webinar, we have a great panel that you will hear from, and we invite you to submit any questions you have through our chat box that you will find on the bottom of your screen. And when you click on chat, the chat window will appear and you can submit your questions in that space. After you hear from our panelists, we will open up our webinar for your questions. So at this time, it is my privilege to introduce Dan Leeds. Dan serves as the founder and president of the National Public Education Action Fund. And at this time, I will turn the webinar over to Dan.
Well, Kyle, thanks so much, and thanks so much to GSE. You guys have really been terrific to work with, so I want to give you a special thank you. Good afternoon to everyone else. Thanks so much for joining us. We know you share our passion for advancing education for all kids. So this is a really exciting time for education. Education will play an increasingly important role in the coming election and, of course, in our future. The good news is increasingly voters recognize the importance of education to their future. And you'll hear in a few minutes from Geoffrey Garin, an acclaimed pollster, who will talk about a poll we did. Before he starts, I just want to take a moment and tell you why I initiated the poll, Education 2020 and Education Champion, which is a project of the National Public Education Action Fund. Basically, I was moved by the evidence, which is really the growing social networks of parents and educators. And these social networks have fueled Red for Ed, which you've all heard about. There's also, for instance, one network called Parents Together that over a few years got to 500,000 members, and then in the last year got to 1.6 million and expects to be at 5 million soon. So the power of the social network is really quite impressive. Another thing I was moved by were the increasing number of polls where voters say they prioritize education. And lastly, it's sort of the election of so many election governors. So for instance, in Idaho, you have Governor Brad Little. In Iowa, you have Governor Laura Kelly. In Louisiana, you have Governor John Bell Edwards. In Michigan, you have Governor Gretchen Whitmer. And in Wisconsin, you have Governor Tony Evers, a lifetime educator. So that's really important. A while back, like 5 months ago, I ran into Geoffrey Garin. So Jeff is an acclaimed pollster, and he's known for groundbreaking polls. He's terrific to work with. And during our conversation, we talked about doing a poll on the importance of how the role education might play in an election and how voters viewed education in an electoral context. And Jeff said two things I thought were particularly striking. One was that he thought that education was a sort of underutilized political tool, and politicians didn't really appreciate the importance it was to voters, that he thought it had to voters. And number two, that really no one had ever done a poll that really looked at education in an electoral context to his knowledge. It's something I've been looking for the 20 years I've been sort of working in the space and never really saw one. So with that said, I'm really excited to turn the conversation over to Jeff and have him tell you about this groundbreaking poll. Thank you, everyone.
Great. Thanks, Dan, and really appreciate the opportunity to work with you and your team on this effort, and also appreciate the opportunity to share what we found with those who have logged on today. So if we would turn one slide. This is, by the way, a survey that we conducted on a national basis. So it's a representative cross-section of the national electorate, and the interviews were done at the very end of August and the very beginning of September. One of the things to keep in mind as we're kind of looking at the data and the results of the poll is a very important finding, which is that of all voters, 55% are in a household that have some direct connection with the education system. They either have a kind of very young child in their household or a child in the K-12 education system, or they may have someone in their household who is dealing with the problem of student debt, or they themselves are worrying about paying for their own child's higher education. They may be in a household where somebody works in education as a teacher or some other capacity, and then 8% are currently students. So when you add all of that together, and people may get into this universe in multiple ways, 5 out of 9 Americans today have some direct connection to education, and that's, you'll see, very important. Those are the voters who are most likely to be responsive to education as a national political issue. I've been doing this for a very, very long time, and we really find that politics is most potent when it's most personal, and there are just a lot of Americans for whom education is a very personal issue. On the next page. So in that context, one of the very important findings is that 3/4 of all voters believe that it's important for the next president of the United States to make education a top national priority. That includes 36% who say it's very important, another 40% who say it's fairly important. It's well established in politics that that people care about education, public education, at a state and local level. I think what Dan was referring to is that that it's also the case that people care about education at a national and federal level, and it is and do think of it as an issue for the president's attention and focus. You can see that in the right-hand side of the slide here. This is just looking at the very top box response, the people who say it's very important, that 36%. They are a little bit more likely to be Democrats than people who intend to vote for President Trump, but 27% of all Trump voters say that education should be a very important priority. It's very important for a president to make education a top national priority. And you can see when we look at those people who are directly connected, whether they have a young child in their household or a K-12 student in their household, or they themselves are students, they are the most likely to feel that education ought to be, that it's very important for the next president to make education a top national priority. On the next chart, in terms of education as a voting issue, we asked people to, on a scale of 0 to 10, how important will a candidate's position and policies on education be to them when they vote. You can see that 4 out of 9 voters rate this as at a very high level, a score of 9 or 10 on this 10-point scale, as being very important to their vote. And frankly, we asked about other issues, and there are other issues that get even higher scores, healthcare and the economy. But still, this is a very substantial portion of the electorate who say this is will be very important to them when they vote. Again, it's 10 points higher among that 55% who are in education households. It's higher among people who intend to vote for a Democrat than among people who intend to vote for President Trump. But again, over a third of President Trump's current supporters say this will be very important to their vote, and 48% of the people who are undecided for president say it'll be very important. It's related to age, not surprisingly. Um, uh, so people under the age of 50 are more likely than over the age of 50. And women and voters of color, particularly African American voters, also tend to put more emphasis on this. On the next chart, we asked not really to kind of suss out the presidential election, but to understand kind of the dynamics here. Where people stand or stood at the beginning of September in terms of their voting intention, whether they're more inclined to vote for President Trump or for a Democratic candidate for president. You can see at the time we did this, by 50 to 39, people were more inclined to vote for a Democrat than for President Trump, with 11% undecided. This was in keeping with most of the national polling that we were doing and seeing at that time, and pretty close to the mark of what's still occurring in national polling. But again, the idea was not necessarily to kind of to suss out who's going to win or who's going to lose the presidential election, but to look at this as sort of as a baseline. Because we asked separately, if there were a Democratic candidate for president who makes education a top priority and offers a clear agenda to strengthen our education system, how would that affect your vote? 62% of voters say, well, if there were a Democrat who did that, they would be more likely to vote for that candidate, including 31% say much more likely. There are very few voters say they would be less likely to vote for a candidate who puts priority on education. And the important thing here, remember, we're talking very specifically about a Democratic candidate. It is reinforcing that people who already intend to vote for a Democrat. But a quarter of all people who intend to vote for President Trump say they would be more likely to vote for a Democrat if she or he made education a top priority and offered a clear agenda to strengthen our education system. And 71% of undecided voters feel that way too. On the next chart, we tested a kind of a variety of thematic approaches for talking about education. Again, we thought about this in terms of a Democratic candidate as kind of sort of framing the issue. There were four that really stood out as being kind of particularly important to voters. The idea that access to quality education should be a right and not a privilege, and we have a responsibility to make sure that we're educating all Americans to be ready for the future. That the importance of education for overcoming inequality and economic disparities, and trying to achieve true equity and educational equity by making sure that there is a quality public school in every neighborhood, including those that are underserved. A framing statement and a value-based statement about respect for teachers is very important, and then a statement about the connection between education and economic opportunity and economic success is very important. And that throughout the research is particularly important to people who are inclined to vote for President Trump. Connection to career and technical education is a priority for them. You can go ahead and change. You can see that emphasis that Trump voters place on career and technical education. Here we kind of segmented education, and it covers obviously a lot of territory. For Democratic, for the people who are currently inclined to vote for President Trump, their real priority within this space is career and technical education programs that provide vocational training for the skills needed to get a good job. For people who intend to vote for a Democratic candidate for president, they're really focused on student debt and college affordability. And then, really among undecided voters, both of those things are priorities, along with a K-12 system that promotes achievement and success for all. Down at the bottom of the chart, you can see in some ways we split the early ed vote by offering two different items related to that: universal access to pre-K and quality care for infants and toddlers. And you can see that individually they're more limited in their reach. But if you aggregate them, 33% of all voters pick one or the other. So there are a lot of people who are interested in the early education space. And that's particularly the case, as I said, all politics is personal, of those who have a child under the age of 5, 45% pick one of those two items as being important to them. On the next chart, in terms of how people feel about education as a reason to reelect or replace President Trump, only 24% say his policies on education are a reason to reelect him. 43% say a reason to replace him, and then 33% say it's not a consideration either way. Part of the issue here, if you look on the kind of the chart on the right-hand side, is that people don't know as much about President Trump's education record as they do about other aspects of his policies. People know where he stands on immigration. They're much less likely to say they know a lot about where he stands on education. Those who feel they know a lot say by 56 to 38 that his handling of education is more of a reason to elect somebody who will take a different approach. But the less you know, the less likely you are to have this be a consideration. And everything I'm talking about stipulates that there would be an effort, such as many on this call are engaged in, to really engage voters in a conversation about education and the president's record and the policies and positions of other candidates. On the next chart, we asked people about various aspects of President Trump's record. There are many parts of that are concerning to voters, including undecided voters, and a lot of what is most concerning has to do with the fact that he, by his record, does not demonstrate a real value in public education. That his budgets have proposed for cuts in public education, and there are specific kinds of cuts in schools, proposed cuts in key school safety programs, funding cuts in career and technical education, again, particularly concerning to Trump voters themselves. So there is important information here. And then on the next slide, also in a kind of more thematic frame, what really stands out here is that he slashed taxes for billionaires, cut regulations for for-profit college companies, and billions in incentives for charter school operators, while shortchanging public schools and cutting programs that serve average American families. And what that all ladders up to is sort of evidence that he consistently puts the wealthy ahead of average people, which is kind of the central point in many campaigns about him. You can see for Trump voters themselves, what's most concerning is his drastic cuts to education in terms of economics and the economic impact of that with regard to job training. The next chart. So after we go through all of this, and remember, we have, we've also tested some criticisms of, potential criticisms of Democratic candidates. We re-asked this trial heat question, and in fact, putting this proposition that people will change their votes based on education to the test. When we redo the survey, this sort of generic trial heat question at the end of the survey, support for the Democratic candidate goes up by 7 points. Support for President Trump's reelection goes down by 7 points. 21% of the people who originally supported President Trump moved to do something else, either to support the Democrat or often moved to undecided. And among the people who were originally undecided, they're splitting in favor of the Democrat by 39 to 12. Again, we're not trying to predict the outcome of the election or expect that people will hear education with the level of intensity they did in this survey, but it does, we think this is more evidence that education really does matter as a factor in the way people think about their electoral preferences, including at the very highest level of voting for president. On the next chart, the one point I really want to emphasize here is that all of this movement occurs among that group of people who don't know a lot already about President Trump's education record. So the movement is really particularly powerful among voters who say they know just some or know little or nothing about his record. So there is a kind of a blank canvas here for many voters, and an opportunity to fill that in a way that's detrimental to the president in the election. Next chart. And the final thing I really want to mention real quickly is the possibility of engaging people in a grassroots effort to promote the importance of education. So we asked them if they had an opportunity to become involved with the Education President campaign, Education Champions, by signing a petition, attending meetings in person or online, contacting candidates to encourage them to endorse the kind of a pro-public education statement of principles. How likely would they be to be involved? We don't put lie detectors on our interviews, and we know about good intentions and the difficulty of really getting in front of everybody's face to ask. But a third of all voters say this is important enough to them that they would personally get involved. 16% say they definitely would get involved. And again, the more they are kind of, have a direct connection to education, the more likely that is the case. So I think that's our last slide. This just reiterates some of the key findings that underline the point that education really can be a very important voting issue in a national election, a presidential election. But that is only true if candidates make the effort to put it front and center, and if advocates also say that there's real issues at stake in communicating with voters. So thanks, and let me turn it back.
Great. Thanks, Jeff. And thank you all for joining this webinar on this really important issue. My name is Laura Shifter, and I'm here talking in my role today as Policy Director of Education 2020. And I'm really excited to be talking to you all and look forward to hearing thoughts and questions later on. But just to tell you a little bit about Education 2020, we are a coalition of organizations representing educators, parents, children and youth, people of color, people with disabilities, and more. And what we think is really powerful about our coalition is we really span the sectors of child well-being, early childhood education, K through 12, and higher education. We're a coalition that's nonpartisan, and we're not trying to impact the outcome of the election. Here is a slide that outlines all of our organizations that are involved. There are about 27 organizations that are part of our coalition. And what we've really come together to do is to try and elevate education in the 2020 election. Can we move forward a slide? Now, in order to come together, what we've looked to do is to build a shared vision across all of these organizations that's really seeking to advance a comprehensive education agenda focused on ensuring universal inclusion and access to ongoing learning opportunities for everyone. And what we're doing is we're calling on all 2020 presidential candidates to develop comprehensive education proposals that are aligned to this shared vision. Now, what we've done to be able to advocate for this shared vision is we've developed 6 policy principles. And the way that we use these policy principles is we see the principles as serving as a rubric or guideposts that the presidential candidates can use to see if their policy proposals are sufficiently robust in thinking about how to advance education. The principles, the framing of these principles, the first 2 are really guiding our motivating factors for our coalition. The first principle really focusing on the need to advance a comprehensive system, and that comprehensive system has to be focused on advancing equity. Then we have a principle on early childhood, K through 12, post-secondary education, and our last principle around the educator workforce and the capacity is about ensuring that we're investing and supporting the infrastructure of our system so that they can do what we are asking them to do. So just to talk a little bit more in detail about each of these principles, where we're focused on the comprehensive system is that the presidential candidates acknowledge and recognize that a democratic society really demands that we provide ongoing learning opportunities for everyone living in America, birth through career. And what's really the focus of this is to ensure that people see this as a continuum, and that, you know, you can't just really focus everything in early childhood and then not really address and consider the needs of students in higher education. Likewise, you can't support higher education and not really think about K through 12. For us to really think about the student and what the student needs and what society needs to ensure that students are successful is that the system is comprehensive, early K through 12 through post-secondary education and career training. Now, again, just to reiterate, what we see as being very important in that system is that there is an emphasis on equity, and that we're really ensuring that all students, any student, can access and benefit from high quality learning opportunities that we provide regardless of their background. Our focus on our early childhood principle is really ensuring that presidential candidates in their proposals address issues related to access, quality, affordability, and the workforce within the early childhood sector, and making sure that we're considering all of those needs when we're putting forward proposals. Our K through 12 proposal is really thinking about how do we kind of strengthen the K through 12 system. So it's really thinking about preparing all students for their future rather than their past. Of course, this includes an important component of increasing investment, but it also is a focus on thinking about how do we encourage student-centered approaches in learning that consider, the social, emotional, and academic needs of all students, and particularly focusing that on the needs of under-resourced schools and underrepresented students. And then in post-secondary education, it's again thinking about what we see as three buckets, ensuring that we're addressing issues around access, quality, and affordability in post-secondary education and workforce programs, and that we're really thinking about what students need to be successful, to be prepared in the workforce without being burdened by debt, and to be able to fully participate in our democracy and our economy. And then lastly, our educator workforce and capacity principle is really focused on ensuring that we're addressing all factors of the educator workforce that include teacher preparation, financial support, and teacher development when they're in practice, to ensure that we're focused on supporting our teachers across the continuum, and also ensuring that we're investing in the physical infrastructure needed in every community, so that our institutions really have support and they can meet the needs of every learner, and that they're supported as a model in our country, and that we acknowledge the role that educational institutions play for our country's success, our economic security, and our future. So those are the 6 principles, and I'm happy to talk more about them in questions, and I'm going to turn it over to Elizabeth, who's going to talk about education champions. So thank you.
Hi, this is Elizabeth Sullivan, and I wanted to talk a little bit about Education Champions. It's a new organization, and our goal is to create a highly educated nation where all Americans have the educational resources from cradle to career, as Laura was just saying, that are necessary to live meaningful lives in a harmonious country, ready to embrace the future and able to drive a prosperous economy. And we are really trying to do this by elevating education issues in the public discourse. What Jeff was saying is, if people know about the education issues, they're more likely to act on the education issues. So we do this by harnessing public support, activating education champions, and helping amplify their voices in order to make education a top priority for local, state, and federal officials. We're setting up a 501c3 as well as a C4, And of course, I'll talk about the 501c3 work today. As you know, a C3 can do nothing to contribute to the election or defeat of a specific candidate, but there's a lot we can do in the civic engagement space. So Education Champions work is going to follow three major tracks. We're going to serving as a public information source about education issues, building digital networks of local education activists, and offering tools for civic engagement activities. Examples of the public information source that we're talking about is commissioning and posting a series of informative articles, and then I'll talk in a minute about helping get people to read them. But issues on topics like how the federal government role in education is important, how underfunding IDEA has very specific effects in the classroom. Things about the rising costs of higher education, the importance of early childhood in social and emotional development, the role of community schools. And so then our next step, building the networks of local education activists, is really how we expect to drive people to read these articles. We're creating networks in local communities, community by community, school by school, of parents, teachers, and education activists, of students in high schools, in colleges, career training students, and business and community leaders. And we are trying to get them to hook these communities together. A lot of these communities already exist, but we want these digital communities to be led by local voices, place by place, state by state. And we're developing highly segmented digital engagement tools. And then we expect to interject important education issues into the organic dialogue. So, for example, if East Middle School parents are concerned about getting an extra janitor and West Middle School parents are concerned about getting playground equipment, they should each be able to talk in their local communities about issues like that. But we want to combine them together to tell them when school board meetings are and remind everybody that primary day is tomorrow and all those kinds of things. So that takes us to examples of civic engagement activities, reminders of primary election dates, encouraging people to write to the superintendent of schools in their state or the secretary of education. Invitations. Public officials and candidates are in their communities, and we want people to know when and where so they can be present and be more engaged. We're also going to provide tools to help these local communities, local digital communities, develop an Ask the Candidates program. People hesitate to ask candidates questions because it's scary. And what we're trying to do is make it easier for them by giving them the tools that help them be more comfortable in it. And we can also get engaged by doing things like creating downloadable signs, which will convey the importance of education in the public dialogue. A sign, this is not wordsmith, but a sign like "My vote counts for education." And so if you are a city council member driving to work and you have to drive past 25 signs that say "My vote counts for education" on your way to a vote in the city council, you're going to notice those signs. So those are examples of the kind of work that we're trying to create. And I think I'm going to turn this over to Kyle so that he can take questions from anybody.
And I think before we do that, thank you so much, Elizabeth. And before we do that, we'll go to Frank for his remarks.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes.
Oh, that's fine.
That's okay. Thank you, Kyle and Elizabeth. So I think I'm Frank Gettridge, and I'm the executive director for the National Public Education Support Fund. And we consider ourselves a network of networks who bring together philanthropy, policymakers, educators, and other practitioners in the field with the goal of one thing, and that is to improve education and also create opportunities for all children to get an excellent education from birth through college. And so one of the things I wanted to talk to you about is the role of philanthropy. In asking ourselves that question, what can philanthropy do at this time to influence policy and take advantage of some of these federal, state, and local policies? So I'd like to couch that for you by thinking about 4 C's that you've heard throughout this presentation. One is convening power. And when we think about convening power, how do we pull together the stakeholder groups and connect them with federal and local agencies to have those conversations and input their voices in order to influence those policies so that they can be related to what the problems are on the ground that they're facing. Again, the next C is capacity building. A lot of these organizations are trying to be proactive. Lots of times we know from working in foundations, our grant making processes can sometimes be a little tedious. And so how do we think more proactively to get these organizations the resources that they need so that they can be more proactive around some of these issues? The second one is coordinated funding or co-investing. This one is more interesting. Every foundation has its mission. Every foundation has its own strategies, but we can't do it without money alone. So how do you partner with other foundations where your mission can complement their mission? And you work in contexts and environments where you can then do a coordinated effort or co-investing to help support a community or organization or agency so that they can truly address these issues that are in front of them. And the last one is around communication. So when we think about communication, or some like to call it narrative change, how do we lift up those issues that are most important to us? We've heard throughout the presentation issues around early childhood access and affordability, teacher compensation, higher education. And so how do we think creatively around taking those issues and really making them a part of the public discourse? And once again, it goes back to not only building the capacity of the organizations, but what are some strong communication organizations out there who foundations can partner with, and they can shine a light on some of those areas that they feel are important. So I think as we move forward, just keeping in the forefront of your mind is the idea around being proactive versus reactive. We know that this presidential election is going to bring us some things that may happen that require some quick action, and so we just want to make sure that we have the communities and organizations ready and prepared to take advantage when that happens. So at this time, I think I'm going to turn it over to Kyle, and now you can have your Q&A.
Thank you, Frank, and thank you, Jeff, Laura, and Elizabeth for sharing your data and programs and strategies that really will impact the role of education with our upcoming 2020 election. I do see a question in our chat box, and this question will be for Laura and Elizabeth. And the question is, what is the relationship between education champions and the Education 2020 Coalition?
Can I suggest, this is Elizabeth, can I suggest that Dan answer that question because he's part of the bridge between us?
Be perfect.
So this is Dan. So first, I just want to point out that I'm the board president for both the National Public Education Action Fund, that's the sponsor of Education Champions, as well as the board president for the National Public Education Support Fund, which is the sponsor of Ed 2020. But that said, Ed 2020 is about broad policy principles, and it's about having a broad coalition and working within the broader coalition of foundations that are partners in the various education collaboratives within the National Public Education Support Fund, which includes Grantmakers for Thriving Youth, the Education Funders Strategy Group, and the Partnership for the Future of Learning. And the C3 side and C4 side of the Education Champions is really much more about advocacy and political efforts. And so it attracts a different, probably a subset of funders. And so they have sort of different objectives. You know, the coalition within Ed 2020 will play so I hope that answers the question.
Great. Thank you, Dan.
I would add one quick thing, which is that Education Champions is a coalition partner of Education 2020, and we have fully adopted the principles that Laura and the Education 2020 Coalition have put together.
Great. Laura, is there anything you'd like to add?
I think just the one other thing to add is just, I think the coalition going forward and kind of thinking about the work ahead in the year for the coalition going forward, I think piggybacking off of what Dan said is going to be more focused around thinking about what the policy opportunities could be or policy needs would be going forward to prepare for whoever the nominee is. I mean, whoever wins the election. Frankly, and thinking about it from that broad policy lens, like what Dan talked about, rather than the direct advocacy to the American people.
Great, great. I have a question, again, for Laura and Elizabeth. And as you think about your work and your engagement with various communities, I was wondering, in your work in rural communities, if you're hearing any particular topics that may be unique to those communities that you may not be hearing in urban areas. Is there a difference in what you're finding, experiencing in your work so far with rural communities?
I'll just start off by talking a little bit about that. I think that's certainly something that a lot of our organizations are focused on ensuring that we address the needs of both urban and rural districts when we're thinking about policy. And I think, particularly concerning are issues around ensuring access for things like quality childcare and making sure that there are sufficient needs in both rural and urban communities. And issues around infrastructure are different and big in both areas. And I think one of the things that we are certainly hoping when we crafted our principles is that they were flexible enough to be able to have policies that address both, and really talking about the needs of under-resourced communities being broad in that sense to cover both urban and rural. So I hope that helps a little bit, but I think it's something that we are certainly keen in being aware of going forward when we're thinking more specifically a layer down from the principles, what needs to be done to ensure that we're addressing the needs of rural schools.
Mm-hmm. Awesome.
So this is Dan. I just want to add on that the rural organizing organization that they've done a large poll, and they said the number one message in rural communities is that rural folks should have equal access to high quality K through 12 and higher education. So I think the demand for education is strong in rural areas, just as it's strong in urban areas.
Mm-hmm. That's a great point, Dan. Thank you. Thank you, Laura. Another question we have for the panel is, and it reads like this: any ideas about how to get the right and, in parentheses, nuanced education-related questions asked at the presidential debates? Seems like the debate moderators play a huge role in what is discussed and prioritized. Also, can you go back and repeat some of the specific issues for polling identified that might bring people together across political parties?
I'm happy to talk a little bit about the first part, because I think this is Laura, by the way, and I would love other people to jump on too. I think it is one of the things that is challenging, is trying to get people to talk about this issue more. And I think, certainly we have tried to figure out if we have any connections to get questions in front of the moderators. We've been filling out forms whenever those things are sent around to say, do you have questions for the candidates, trying to insert them. I think part of the challenge in that is that despite what we've seen in the poll that was presented here, it is hard to elevate that at a national level. So where our focus has actually been in trying to push that it is discussed more, is pushing that more with the presidential campaigns. And one of the things that we have been doing with Education 2020 recently, and we made this available to all campaigns, Democrat and Republican, an opportunity to have our coalition brief them on the principles and the issues that we've outlined, and the opportunity to try and elevate education. Now we have had some campaigns sign up, and one of the things that we continue to do is to try and push them beyond just having robust proposals, to also elevate this in their narrative when they're talking about their vision for the country. So it is something that we are continuing to work on and push in the coalition's perspective. Elizabeth, I don't know if you want to add anything from Education Champions' perspective.
Hold on, I'll pass the phone to Elizabeth. I'm reading hers my dad.
Hi, I'm sorry, I don't know. I can hear you all, but y'all can't hear me. So we are on our way right now. It's supposed to say tomorrow is an MSNBC filming of a forum on public education, and we are sponsors of it, although the primary sponsors are AFT and NEA. And so when we do this, they're going to be filming, and they're going to be asking entirely about education issues. It's hard. The DNC rules don't let us have actually a debate, so we're not doing that. But there's a forum where each of them will be, 8 of them will be taped saying something, talking about education issues. In addition to that, Education Champions is organizing what we're calling the digital forum, where we are capturing different candidates and asking them a standard set of questions that are actually based on the Education 2020 principles. They're not exactly the principles, but they're very close to it. And in that situation, what we're doing is just getting them on film for 20 minutes or so, and then we're going to download it. And we are working with the media outlet called ATTN, Attention, and they have all sorts of digital channels that we'll be working from. And so they have literally, I don't remember, 2.1, 2.5 million followers. And when you count how many people actually get onto their network in a year, it's like 100 million hits, I think, or some 100 million individual hits, Dan is telling me. So we're trying to get the candidates talking about education. We're trying to persuade them that they need to talk about education. And I think we're going to have some success. I'm really excited about what's happening tomorrow, both in our filming for the digital forum, but also in MSNBC's filming. I think that it's supposed to be on the air on MSNBC tomorrow night, although I'm not 100% sure of that.
And I know the second part of the question really would be directed to Jeff, but he had another commitment, so he's
I'm
Jeff is here. Great.
I'm still here. So on kind of what are the things that bring people together and kind of cross partisanship? If you remember those sort of value-based statements that we showed you earlier, those are things where the numbers are larger with Democrats than with Republicans, but majorities of both Democrats and Republicans and independents all identify with these statements. So the idea that access to quality education should be a right in America, not just a privilege. We have a responsibility to make sure that we're educating all Americans to be ready for the future. That's kind of a unifying notion. It's 83% of Democrats who say they're more likely to be for a candidate who stands for that, but so do 54% of Republican voters. Education is our best tool for overcoming disparities in our country. We want to make sure there's equity in America with quality schools in every neighborhood, including those who have been underserved. 81% of Democrats, but 55% of Republicans. say they'd be more likely to vote for a candidate who stands for that. Teachers even more, kind of very unifying. We've seen what's happened in red states recently over the past year and a half with kind of pretty militant teacher actions. Even in the reddest of states, teachers have had supports. So when we say that we can't have a true commitment to education if we don't treat our teachers and other educators with respect they deserve, we need to raise teacher pay and make sure educators receive the training and support they need. 6 in 10 Republicans say I'd be more likely to vote for a candidate who stands for that, including as well as 7 in 9 Democrats. And then the idea of that people need access to education and training on a lifelong basis because getting a good job depends more and more on a good education and learning skills. So all of those things cut across party lines as core values. And when we're dealing with education and access to education as a value, that brings people together. It doesn't divide people at all.
Great, thank you, Jeff. We are nearing the end of our time together. So if there's anyone that has a final question, feel free to put it in the chat box. And in the meantime, I would love to invite you to join GFE in 2020 for our monthly masterclass webinars on the first Friday of every month. On January 10th, we will be discussing promising new ways to predict student success beyond testing with Dr. Karabu Jackson. And on Friday, February 7th, you will hear from Dr. Francis Perriman on the confirmed link between school discipline and racial disparities and what that means for funders. So as we conclude, on behalf of Grantmakers for Education, I want to thank Dan, Frank, Laura, Jeff, and Elizabeth for an engaging conversation today, and one that really sets the tone for things that we will experience, between now and the election, whether it's the debate tomorrow night, all the way through the election, and working with our communities in the area of civic engagement and equity. I want to pass the webinar back to Dan for any last words or comments from or the panel, but I'll turn it over to Dan.
Great. Well, I just want to hope you all found this webinar interesting and useful. I want you to know you should feel free to email questions or let me know if you want to know more. I also want to make it, I think one of the reasons education has grown in terms of its political clout comes from the growing realization and concern about affordability of higher education and student loan debt. I think as education, given those increasing need for lifelong learning, I think as people become more interested and more focused on lifelong career training, you'll see that political power continues to grow. It also means we have to work across the continuum and stick together from early childhood to K-12 to higher ed, career training. When we pull that all together, that we really get power. I want to again thank Kyle and GFE. You guys have been terrific to work with. I want to thank the panel. That was great. And I want to thank all of you for joining us. That was really terrific. And lastly, I just want to wish you all the very best for a happy, healthy, and wonderful holiday season. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Dan. Take care, everyone. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh.